Security, remove this woman from my event. She's making the guests uncomfortable. Claire Ashford didn't raise her voice when she said it. She didn't need to. The ballroom at the Riverside Grand Hotel held its collective breath. 200 guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos suddenly frozen mid-conversation. Daisy Weblock stood alone on the marble floor, 7 months pregnant, wearing an emerald dress that her husband Matthew had once said made her eyes shine. Her hand instinctively moved to protect her belly as Claire's words landed like physical blows. "I'm Matthew's wife," Daisy said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I organized this gala." Claire's smile was diamond sharp. "Darling, you're not his wife tonight. You're just the woman who's overstayed her welcome." Not one person in that glittering crowd spoke up. Not the donors Daisy had personally called. Not the volunteers she'd worked beside for months. Not even Matthew, who stood 3 steps behind Claire, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the chandeliers. What none of them knew, not Claire in her pristine white dress, not Matthew in his careful silence, not the guests who would later claim they didn't want to get involved, was that this humiliation was being witnessed. Because before the night ended, a private jet would touch down on the estate's runway. And when Morris and Velma Wallace stepped out, they wouldn't be coming to beg forgiveness for their daughter. They'd be coming to show her she never needed it. Hi there, if you're feeling angry right now, good. That means you see what I see. But before we proceed, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Share this video to someone that needs to see it and comment below where you are watching from. 6 hours earlier, Daisy wasn't standing in a ballroom being stripped of her dignity. She was exactly where she belonged, sitting beside an elderly woman at St. Catherine's shelter, helping her fill out housing assistance forms. "You're so patient," the woman had whispered, tears in her eyes. "Nobody else would take this much time with me." Daisy had squeezed her hand gently. "Everyone deserves someone who'll take the time, especially you, Mrs. Chen." This was who Daisy Weblock was when no one was watching. Not Matthew Weblock's pregnant wife. Not the woman who'd married up, according to the society pages. She was the daughter of Morris and Velma Wallace, 2 people who taught her that dignity came from service, not status, and that kindness was the only currency that actually mattered. She had degrees from Brown and Columbia. She'd built a network of community centers that served over 5,000 families annually. She'd organized food drives, medical clinics, literacy programs, all quietly, all without demanding her name appear in headlines. But tonight, at the charity gala she'd spent 6 months planning, none of that would matter to the people who'd decided she didn't belong. Matthew Weblock had been different once, or Daisy had believed he was. They'd met at a volunteer event 4 years ago. He'd shown up to help renovate a youth center, sleeves rolled up, no cameras following. He'd pursued her for 8 months before she finally said yes to dinner. Their wedding had been small, intimate, focused on meaning rather than spectacle. For 2 years, Daisy thought she'd found a partner who shared her values. Then Claire Ashford entered their lives. Officially, Claire was Matthew's new VP of Communications. Brilliant, strategic, ambitious. Unofficially, she'd made it clear from their first meeting that she considered Daisy a temporary obstacle. The late-night strategy sessions, the business trips that didn't appear on his calendar, the way Claire's hand lingered on Matthew's arm just a beat too long during company events. Daisy had noticed. She'd tried to address it. Matthew had called her paranoid and emotional. Now, 7 months pregnant and getting ready for the gala, Daisy received a text from an unknown number. "Don't go tonight, they've planned something. Please." She should have listened. The Riverside Grand Ballroom looked like something from a fairy tale. If fairy tales were written by people who measured magic in carats and square footage. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished marble. Ice sculptures melted slowly beside champagne towers. Laughter tinkled through air thick with expensive perfume and older money. Daisy arrived at 7:15 p.m., slightly out of breath from the stairs. She'd chosen the emerald dress carefully. Matthew had once told her it made her look radiant. She'd spent an hour on her makeup, wanting to look professional, polished, proud of the literacy initiative she'd built from nothing. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt it, the shift in temperature. The way conversations died mid-sentence as she passed. The sidelong glances that lingered just long enough to sting. And there, at the center of the room like she owned every inch of marble beneath her feet, stood Claire Ashford, right beside Matthew, wearing a dress almost identical to Daisy's, except Claire's was white, deliberately, unmistakably white. Daisy approached the first familiar face, Eleanor Hartwick, a philanthropist who donated $150,000 specifically for Daisy's community programs. "Eleanor, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you again for your incredible support of—" Claire materialized between them like she'd been waiting in the wings. "Mrs. Hartwick, how lovely that you could join us." Claire's smile was warm, her voice musical. "I'm Claire Ashford, Matthew's partner in tonight's meaningful work." Partner. The word dripped with intention. "I'm actually his wife," Daisy said, keeping her voice level. "And I founded the literacy program that—" "Of course you are, sweetheart." Claire's smile never flickered. "On paper, anyway. But we both know who really manages the important details these days, don't we?" Eleanor Hartwick looked deeply uncomfortable. She mumbled something about finding her table and disappeared into the crowd without making eye contact. This scene repeated itself. 5 times, 6 times, 7. Every donor Daisy tried to thank, Claire intercepted. Every conversation Daisy started, Claire torpedoed with surgical precision. It was choreographed, deliberate, a masterclass in social destruction disguised as gracious hosting. At one point, Claire glanced at Daisy's wrist and let out a theatrical gasp. "Oh my goodness, what a sweet little bracelet. Did you get that at one of those charming little boutiques you're always visiting?" A woman nearby leaned toward her companion and whispered just loud enough, "That's actually a vintage Cartier piece, worth about $40,000. Daisy heard every word. She didn't correct Claire. What would be the point? People like Claire didn't traffic in truth. They dealt in perception. And right now, Claire was winning. The seating arrangement was where cruelty became concrete. Daisy walked to the head table, the table she'd personally organized 3 weeks earlier, placing each name card with intention. Her nameplate was gone. In its place sat a woman she'd never met, laughing at something Matthew's business partner had just said. "Excuse me," Daisy said politely. "I think there's been a mistake. This is my assigned seat." Claire appeared instantly, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Actually, this table is reserved for people who make meaningful contributions to the foundation." Her voice carried across nearby tables, ensuring maximum audience. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable near the service entrance. I'm sure that would feel more natural." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances. None of them spoke. 2 security guards approached with rehearsed concern. "Ma'am, we need you to step aside while we verify your invitation." "Verify my—" Daisy's voice caught. "I'm Daisy Weblock, Matthew's wife. I organized this entire event. My name is on every invitation." The guard's expression remained professionally blank. "Ma'am, please step aside. We're following protocol." Daisy looked across the ballroom at Matthew. He was watching. He'd seen everything. Their eyes met across the glittering crowd of people who'd decided she was the problem. "Matthew," her voice cracked despite every effort to steady it. "Matthew, please." For a heartbeat, something flickered across his face. Recognition. Shame. The ghost of whatever he'd once felt for her. Then it vanished. "Claire is managing logistics tonight," he said flatly, his voice carrying just far enough. "Let's not make a scene, Daisy. We can discuss this at home." Discuss this at home. His pregnant wife was being publicly erased, and his only concern was avoiding embarrassment. The room understood what Daisy was just beginning to realize. Silence in moments like this wasn't neutrality. It was choosing a side. 6 hours before security guards asked for her invitation to an event bearing her own name, Daisy wasn't standing in a ballroom wondering how her life had unraveled. She was sitting in a community center in East Hartford, teaching a 72-year-old woman named Mrs. Chen how to fill out housing assistance forms. I don't understand all these questions, Mrs. Chen said, her hands trembling slightly as she held the pen. My English isn't good enough for this. Your English is perfect, Daisy said gently, moving her chair closer. And we'll go through every single question together. There's no rush. It took 45 minutes. When they finished, Mrs. Chen grabbed Daisy's hand with surprising strength. Why do you do this? You could be anywhere else, Daisy smiled. This is exactly where I want to be. It was the truth. And it was a truth her parents had spent 28 years teaching her. Morris and Velma Wallace had never believed in loud philanthropy. They didn't put their names on buildings or attend galas where donors competed to see who could write the largest check. Instead, they showed up, quietly, consistently, at soup kitchens on Thanksgiving morning, at literacy centers on Saturday afternoons, at hospitals where families couldn't afford to stay in hotels nearby. Money is easy to give, Morris had told Daisy when she was 12, watching him help an elderly veteran navigate a VA benefits application. Time is what people actually need. Your presence, your attention, the message that they matter enough for you to sit down beside them. Velma had taught her something equally important. Kindness isn't about being nice, sweetheart. It's about seeing people clearly, their dignity, their worth, even when they can't see it themselves. These weren't abstract lessons delivered over dinner. They were lived. Daisy spent her childhood watching her parents treat every person they encountered, from CEOs to custodians, with identical respect. She learned that service wasn't something you did to feel good about yourself. It was something you did because other people deserved to feel good about themselves. By the time Daisy graduated from Brown, then Columbia, she'd already founded her first community literacy program. By 25, she'd expanded it to 7 cities. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she'd seen what happened when a single mother learned to read well enough to help her children with homework. She'd witnessed the transformation when a laid-off factory worker gained the skills to fill out job applications without shame. Kindness, Daisy believed, wasn't weakness. It was the most powerful force in the world. And when she met Matthew Weblock, she thought she'd found someone who understood that. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and comment your location below. Their first meeting wasn't at a gala or a boardroom. It was at a youth center renovation project in New Haven. Daisy was painting walls. Matthew showed up with a crew from his company. No cameras, no press releases, just 20 people in old clothes ready to work. He'd painted the entire west wall beside her, making conversation about everything except money or business. They talked about books, about the neighborhood, about why the community center mattered. My dad used to bring me to places like this when I was a kid, Matthew had said, rolling paint across cracked plaster. He said if you wanted to know what a city actually cared about, look at who it leaves behind. Daisy had looked at him then, really looked, and thought, this one's different. He pursued her for 8 months. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became weekends volunteering together. He showed up at her literacy program events without being asked. He remembered the names of the families she worked with. He listened when she talked about the mother who'd learned to read her daughter's bedtime stories or the veteran who'd finally filled out his disability paperwork. You're changing lives, he'd told her once, his voice full of something that sounded like admiration. That matters more than anything I do in a boardroom. She'd believed him. Their wedding was small, 60 people in a garden, focused on meaning rather than spectacle. Daisy's parents had walked her down the aisle together, both of them beaming. Matthew's vows had been simple. I promise to see you, to support the work that matters to you, to never ask you to become smaller so I can feel bigger. For 2 years, he'd kept those promises. But promises, Daisy would learn, were easier to keep when no one was testing them. The red flags started small. So small, Daisy convinced herself she was imagining them. The way Matthew began missing her program events. I'm sorry, something came up at work. The way he stopped asking about her day. I'm exhausted. Can we talk about this later? The way he started checking his phone during dinner. His expression distracted, distant. When Daisy found out she was pregnant, she thought it would change things. Bring them back to who they'd been. She'd told him over breakfast, her hands shaking slightly as she placed the positive test on the table between them. Matthew had stared at it for a long moment. Then he'd smiled, a careful, measured smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's wonderful, Daisy, really." But he hadn't held her, hadn't kissed her, hadn't asked how she was feeling or what she needed. He'd simply said, "We should probably think about scaling back your volunteer work. You'll need to rest." Daisy had nodded, pushing down the unease rising in her chest. Maybe he was right. Maybe pregnancy did require adjustments. Maybe she was reading too much into a momentary reaction. She'd spent years believing the best in people. She wasn't going to stop now. That's when Claire Ashford entered their lives. "My new VP of Communications," Matthew had introduced her at a company dinner. "Brilliant strategist. She's going to help expand our public profile." Claire had shaken Daisy's hand with a smile that showed too many teeth. "Matthew speaks so highly of your charity work. It must be so fulfilling to have hobbies." Hobbies. The word landed like a dismissal. But Daisy had smiled back because that's what you did when you believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe Claire was just awkward. Maybe she didn't mean it the way it sounded. The late-night text started 3 weeks later, the business trips that weren't on Matthew's calendar. The way he began defending Claire preemptively. "She's just intense about her work. Don't read into it." Daisy had tried to talk to him. "Matthew, I'm not comfortable with how much time—" "You're being paranoid," he'd interrupted, his voice sharp. "And frankly, a little embarrassing. Claire is a professional colleague, that's all." So Daisy had swallowed her concerns. Because maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe pregnancy hormones were making her see threats where none existed. Maybe kindness meant trusting your husband when he asked you to. Even now, 7 months pregnant, planning a gala she'd poured her heart into, Daisy still believed that Matthew would remember who they'd been. That Claire was temporary. That love, real love, would eventually win. As she'd applied her makeup that evening, smoothing the emerald fabric over her belly, she'd whispered to her unborn child, "Your father is a good man. He just needs to be reminded." She'd believed kindness would protect her. She'd believed love was stronger than ambition. She'd believed that showing up, being present, refusing to match cruelty with cruelty would eventually matter. Walking into that ballroom, Daisy still had faith. In Matthew, in people, in the fundamental goodness she'd spent her entire life cultivating and witnessing. That faith was about to be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But it wouldn't be destroyed. Because Daisy Weblock was her parents' daughter. And Morris and Velma Wallace hadn't raised a woman who broke. They'd raised one who bent, and then stood back up. Claire Ashford had been planning this moment for 3 months. Not the gala itself. That was Daisy's work, her careful coordination, her endless phone calls to donors and volunteers. No, Claire had been planning something else entirely, the systematic dismantling of Daisy Weblock's credibility in front of everyone who mattered. It started during the cocktail hour, in the powder room where Claire accidentally encountered Patricia Morehouse, wife of Matthew's largest investor. "I'm worried about her," Claire said softly, touching up her lipstick in the mirror beside Patricia. "Daisy's been so emotional lately. The pregnancy, you know. Matthew's been trying to shield her from stress, but she insists on being so involved." Patricia's reflection showed concern. "Should we be worried?" "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing." Claire's tone suggested precisely the opposite. "Matthew just asked me to keep an eye on things tonight. Make sure she doesn't overwhelm herself. You know how she gets. You know how she gets." As if Patricia knew Daisy at all. As if there was a shared understanding between them about Daisy's supposed instability. Patricia nodded sympathetically. By the time she returned to the ballroom, she'd already mentioned her concern to 3 other women. Claire smiled at her reflection. This was going to be easier than she'd thought. Matthew watched from across the room as Claire intercepted another conversation Daisy was trying to have. He saw the way Daisy's shoulders tensed, the way her hand moved protectively to her belly, the small, wounded look that flickered across her face before she smiled again. That relentless, exhausting smile she wore like armor. Something twisted in his chest. Guilt, maybe. Or the memory of who he'd been before Claire had convinced him that sentiment was a liability in business. "You can't let her keep embarrassing you like this," Claire had said 3 weeks ago, her hand on his arm, her voice low and intimate. "The donors are talking. They want sophistication, Matthew. Strategy. Not some bleeding heart charity case who treats your company events like church fundraisers. He'd wanted to defend Daisy, should have defended her. But Claire's words had found the insecure part of him that wondered if maybe his wife's relentless goodness was actually naive, unsophisticated, bad for business. Now, watching Daisy navigate Claire's calculated cruelty with grace, Matthew felt something close to shame. But not close enough to make him act. Daisy approached the refreshment table, hoping for a moment to breathe. A young server, she couldn't have been more than 19, was arranging champagne flutes with trembling hands. "Are you okay?" Daisy asked quietly. The girl jumped, nearly dropping a glass. "I'm sorry, I'm new. This is my first event this fancy, and I keep messing up, and you're doing beautifully," Daisy said, steadying the tray with gentle hands. "Take a breath. Nobody's watching as closely as you think." The server's eyes filled with tears. "You're really nice. Not like—" She glanced across the room where Claire held court, then stopped herself. "Never mind." "Like who?" Daisy asked gently. "That woman in white. She screamed at one of the kitchen staff earlier for bringing the wrong color napkins. Made her cry." The server lowered her voice. "Bye. We all think you're really brave for being so kind when she's been so awful to you all night." So others had noticed. The thought was both comforting and devastating. Before Daisy could respond, Claire appeared like she'd been summoned by some internal alarm system. "There you are, Daisy. We need to discuss the auction schedule." Claire's smile was bright, professional. She turned to the server dismissively. "Run along now. The adults need to talk." The server fled. Daisy straightened, meeting Claire's eyes with quiet dignity. "The auction schedule is finalized," Daisy said. "We went over it 3 times this week." "Well, I've made some adjustments." Claire pulled out her phone, scrolling through notes. "Your literacy program segment has been moved. It was dragging down the energy of the room. We're putting the art collection showcase there instead." "The literacy program is the entire point of tonight," Daisy said, her voice still calm despite the anger rising in her throat. "That's what the donors came to support." "The donors came to be seen supporting something prestigious," Claire corrected. "Your little reading initiative is sweet, Daisy, but it's not exactly inspiring major gifts. My little reading initiative raised over $2 million last year." "Did it? Or did Matthew's name raise $2 million? Claire's smile never wavered. "Let's not confuse correlation with causation, sweetheart." A waiter passing by slowed deliberately, pretending to adjust glasses on his tray so he could stay within earshot. Daisy noticed. So did Claire. "You're making a scene," Claire said, louder now. Her voice carefully calibrated to sound concerned rather than confrontational. "Maybe you should sit down. You look flushed." "I'm fine." "Are you? Because honestly, Daisy, you've seemed off all night, confused, agitated." Claire placed a hand on Daisy's arm, a gesture that would look caring to anyone watching. Her grip was anything but. "I really think you should rest, for the baby's sake." Daisy pulled her arm away gently. "Don't touch me. There's no need to be hostile." Claire's voice carried beautifully across the immediate area. Several heads turned. "I'm trying to help you." What happened next unfolded in the kind of slow motion that trauma creates. Daisy turned to walk away. Claire stepped forward, not blocking her path exactly, but close enough to make the space between them uncomfortable. Daisy moved to step around her. Claire shifted position at precisely the wrong moment, or precisely the right moment, depending on your perspective. Their shoulders collided. Daisy stumbled slightly, her balance already precarious with the weight of her pregnancy. Claire's hand shot out, ostensibly to steady her, but the push was unmistakable. Not violent, not dramatic, just enough. Daisy's heel caught on the hem of her dress. She didn't fall, but she staggered, her hand flying to her belly in instinctive protection. The gasp that went through the nearby guests was immediate. "Oh my God," Claire said loudly, reaching for Daisy again. "Are you okay? You nearly fell. Daisy, you need to sit down right now." 2 security guards materialized as if they'd been waiting for their cue. "She's not well," Claire told them, her voice dripping with concern. "She's been erratic all evening. I think she might need medical attention." I'm fine, Daisy said. Her voice shaking now, not from fear, but from the dawning realization of what was happening. I don't need— Ma'am, please come with us, one of the guards said gently. We just want to make sure you're safe. Safe from what? Daisy looked around wildly. The waiter who'd lingered earlier had disappeared. The server she'd comforted was nowhere to be seen. Faces that had seemed friendly an hour ago were now carefully neutral, deliberately looking away. Matthew, Daisy called across the room. Her voice cracked on his name. Matthew, please. He was standing with a group of investors, his face carefully blank. For one heartbreaking moment, their eyes met. She saw him hesitate, saw something almost like love flicker across his expression. Then Claire moved to his side, slipping her hand through his arm, and Matthew looked away. Let's not make this worse, Claire said quietly to the guards, her back to the crowd so only Daisy could see her smile. Just escort her somewhere quiet. She needs to calm down. The guards, professionals following orders, not cruel, just doing their jobs, gently guided Daisy toward the service corridor. She didn't fight them. What would be the point? Fighting would only confirm Claire's narrative. As they led her away, Daisy caught the eye of the young server from earlier. The girl was crying silently, mouthing, "I'm sorry," as Daisy passed. At least someone saw the truth. The service corridor was cold, fluorescent lit, nothing like the warm glow of the ballroom. Daisy stood against the wall, her hands pressed to her belly where her baby was kicking, strong, insistent, alive. One of the guards, an older man with kind eyes, stepped closer. Ma'am, are you really okay? Do you need a doctor? No, Daisy whispered. I need my husband. But Matthew wasn't coming. She knew that now. Through the corridor door, she could hear Claire's voice, bright and reassuring. She's fine, just overwhelmed. You know how pregnancy can be. Let's continue with the evening, shall we? The auction would go on. The donors would applaud. Claire would accept congratulations for managing a difficult situation with such grace. And Daisy would stand here, alone, trying to understand how kindness had led to this. A waitress appeared with a glass of water and a coat. Here, she said quietly, draping it over Daisy's shoulders. It's cold out here. Thank you, Daisy managed. We saw what she did, the waitress whispered. We all saw, for what it's worth. It was worth something. Not enough to change what had happened, but something. Daisy left through the service entrance, walking into the night air that felt like ice against her flushed skin. Behind her, the gala continued. Champagne flowed, auction paddles rose. The charity she'd built was being celebrated by people who just watched her be erased. She pressed her forehead against the cool stone of the building and whispered to her unborn child. I'm still here, we're still okay. But she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. What Daisy didn't know was that her parents had been watching everything unfold, and Morris and Velma Wallace were already on their way. The night air hit Daisy like a physical thing, sharp, cold, clarifying. She stood on the marble steps outside the Riverside Grand Hotel, her breath forming small clouds in the December darkness. Behind her, the muffled sound of the gala continued. Laughter, applause, the gentle clink of champagne glasses celebrating a charity she'd built with her own hands. Her hands were trembling, not from the cold, from the aftershock of understanding what had just happened. She'd been erased. Methodically, publicly, deliberately erased from her own event while 200 people watched and said nothing. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, a sharp, insistent reminder of presence. Daisy's hand moved instinctively to the spot, pressing gently. I know, she whispered. I feel you too. Another kick, stronger this time, almost indignant. Despite everything, Daisy smiled. Her child was fighting back in the only way it could, reminding her that she wasn't alone, even when every adult in that ballroom had chosen to leave her that way. Mrs. Weblock? Daisy turned. A parking valet, young, maybe 20, with concerned eyes, was holding out a wool coat. Not hers, someone else's. You looked cold, he said quietly. I grabbed this from the coat check. You can return it later. I can't. Yes, you can. He draped it over her shoulders with the careful gentleness of someone who'd seen his own mother struggle. I saw what happened in there, what that woman did. It wasn't right. Daisy's throat tightened. "Thank you." He nodded and disappeared back into the hotel, leaving her wrapped in borrowed warmth and unexpected dignity. She should call someone, should do something. But who? And what? Call the media? Turn this into a public spectacle? That's what Claire would expect. What she'd probably already prepared for, the narrative already crafted. Unstable pregnant woman makes scene at charity gala. Husband's colleague forced to intervene. No, Daisy wouldn't give her that satisfaction. But she also couldn't just endure this. Could she? The question sat heavy in her chest alongside her heartbeat. For 28 years, Daisy had been taught that kindness meant absorbing hurt without returning it, that grace meant turning the other cheek. That dignity came from refusing to descend to cruelty even when cruelty was employed against you. But standing here alone, her baby kicking protest against her ribs, Daisy felt something shift inside her. Kindness didn't mean endurance. Grace didn't require silence. Dignity wasn't supposed to feel like disappearing. Her parents had taught her to be kind, but they'd also taught her that she mattered, that her worth wasn't conditional on other people's recognition, that she didn't need permission to take up space in the world. She'd forgotten that second part, or maybe she'd been convinced to forget it. Matthew's voice echoed in her memory. "Let's not make a scene, Daisy." As if her pain was the problem, as if her presence was the disruption, as if she was something to be managed rather than someone to be loved. Daisy pulled out her phone, her fingers still trembling slightly. She scrolled to her parents' contact. Her thumb hovered over the call button. They would come immediately. She knew that. Morris and Velma Wallace would drop everything, charter a flight, arrive ready to dismantle Claire's narrative piece by careful piece. They would protect her, but calling them felt like admitting defeat. Like confirming that she couldn't handle this herself. That all her education, all her work, all her careful cultivation of grace and kindness hadn't been enough to protect her from something as simple as human cruelty. She lowered the phone. Then the baby kicked again, hard enough to make her gasp. "Okay," Daisy whispered, her hand pressed to her belly. "Okay, I hear you." Her daughter, she'd found out 2 weeks ago it was a girl, deserved better than a mother who confused endurance with strength. Deserved to see that asking for help wasn't weakness, that you could be kind without being small, that grace didn't mean accepting humiliation as the price of being good. Daisy opened a text message to her mother. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, typing 3 words she'd been too proud to say for months. "I need you." She stared at the message for a long moment. Then she pressed send. The response came within seconds. "We're already on our way." Daisy's breath caught. "Already?" Another message appeared. "We've been watching, sweetheart. We see you. We've always seen you. We'll be there by morning." Something broke open in Daisy's chest. Not despair, but relief so profound it felt like physical pain. Her parents had been watching, had seen Claire's cruelty, had witnessed Matthew's silence, had understood what Daisy had been too afraid to admit even to herself. She wasn't paranoid, she wasn't emotional, she wasn't overreacting. She was being hurt. And someone had finally acknowledged it. Daisy pulled the borrowed coat tighter around her shoulders and looked back at the hotel one last time. Light spilled from the windows. Music drifted into the night. Inside, Claire was probably accepting compliments for handling a difficult situation with such professional grace. But Daisy was no longer thinking about Claire. She was thinking about her parents on a jet somewhere between their home and hers. About her daughter kicking fierce protest against injustice. About the valet and the waitress and the server. Strangers who'd shown her more loyalty in moments than her own husband had shown in months. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. But tonight, Daisy walked to her car alone, carrying her child and her dignity, and the knowledge that kindness wasn't her weakness. It was her truth. And truth, her father had always said, has a way of demanding to be seen. 3 hours before Daisy sent her message, Morris Wallace was watching his daughter get pushed on a phone screen 3,000 miles away. The footage had come from an anonymous number, likely one of the staff members who'd witnessed what happened. 37 seconds of crystal-clear video. Claire's calculated positioning, the subtle shove disguised as steadying, Daisy's instinctive protection of her belly, the security guards appearing like they'd been waiting for their cue, and Matthew, standing motionless, silent. Morris watched it once, then again, then a third time, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the moment his daughter's face registered not just hurt, but understanding. The recognition that she was alone. "Morris?" Velma appeared in the doorway of his study, already reading his expression. "What is it?" He turned the phone toward her without speaking. Velma watched in silence. When it ended, she closed her eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind she'd taught Daisy to take when emotions threatened to overwhelm reason. "That girl still thinks she has to endure," she said softly, her voice carrying decades of controlled heartbreak. Morris nodded. "Then it's time she learns she never had to." They didn't rage, didn't shout, didn't immediately call lawyers or make threats. That wasn't who Morris and Velma Wallace were. Instead, they sat together in the study they'd shared for 35 years of marriage and made a single phone call to their pilot. "We need to be in Connecticut by morning," Morris said, discreetly. "Understood, sir. I'll file the flight plan now." No dramatics, no declarations of war, just quiet, purposeful action, the same approach they'd taken to everything in their lives. Velma pulled out her tablet and began reviewing what she knew about Matthew Weblock and Claire Ashford. Not because she needed ammunition, because she needed understanding. You couldn't correct a situation without first comprehending it fully. "He was different when they met," Velma said, scrolling through old photos of Matthew and Daisy at volunteer events. "I watched him. He seemed genuine." "Seemed," Morris repeated. The word hung heavy between them. "People change," Velma said, or they reveal who they always were." Morris stood and walked to the bookshelf where photographs documented Daisy's entire life. Daisy at 6, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a donation jar she'd decorated herself for a school fundraiser. Daisy at 12, serving food at a community kitchen. Daisy at 22, graduating Columbia, her eyes bright with purpose. "We taught her to be kind," Morris said quietly. "Did we teach her too well?" "No," Velma's voice was firm. "We taught her correctly, but we also taught her that kindness doesn't mean accepting cruelty. She just forgot that part. Or someone convinced her to forget it." Velma joined him at the bookshelf, her hand finding his. They'd raised their daughter with specific values. Empathy without martyrdom, service without self-erasure, strength that didn't require domination. "Do you remember what she said when she was 7?" Velma asked. "After that boy pushed her at the playground?" Morris smiled despite the situation. "She said, 'I don't want to push him back, but I also don't want to let him think pushing is okay.' So she told the teacher, clearly, calmly, without shame. And we told her we were proud of her for protecting herself without becoming cruel." They stood together in shared memory of the child they'd raised, brilliant, compassionate, strong in ways that didn't announce themselves loudly. "She needs reminding," Velma said, "She needs witnesses," Morris corrected. "People who will stand beside her without making her smaller in the process." The jet was arranged within the hour. Not the ostentatious display they could have chosen. They owned 3 aircraft, including one that regularly appeared in wealth magazines. Instead, they selected the smallest, a modest Gulfstream they used for quiet travel, because this wasn't about showing Matthew Weblock their wealth. It was about showing their daughter their presence. Velma packed quickly, a single overnight bag containing clothing suitable for a difficult conversation. Morris made 3 additional calls. One to their attorney, one to a private investigator they trusted, one to the director of the foundation they ran. "We may need documentation," he told each of them. "Quietly, thoroughly. Nothing that harms anyone unnecessarily. Just truth." By midnight, they were airborne. Velma sat across from Morris in the cabin, her hands folded in her lap, her expression peaceful despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "We're not going there for revenge," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Morris agreed. "We're going to restore what was taken from her. Dignity, agency, the knowledge that silence isn't required. That grace doesn't mean disappearing." Velma's phone buzzed. Daisy's message appeared on the screen. "I need you." She showed it to Morris. His expression softened. "She remembered," he said quietly. "She's our daughter." Of course she remembered. Velma typed her response, then added, "She doesn't need us to rescue her, Morris. She needs us to stand beside her while she remembers how to rescue herself." "Then that's what we'll do." 3 hours later, as dawn began to break over Connecticut, the pilot's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. and Mrs. Wallace, we're beginning our descent. ETA 15 minutes. Morris looked out the window at the landscape below. Expensive homes dotting the coastline, private estates with manicured lawns, the kind of wealth that believed it could purchase immunity from consequences. "She's not alone anymore," Velma said, watching the same view. "She never was," Morris replied. "She just needed reminding." The jet descended through early morning clouds, carrying two people who understood something Matthew Weblock and Claire Ashford had forgotten. True power doesn't announce itself with cruelty. It simply shows up and refuses to leave until dignity is restored. Matthew Weblock's estate looked picture-perfect in the morning light. Manicured lawns, marble fountains, white-columned terraces where 60 carefully selected guests sipped mimosas and praised his generosity. The post-gala brunch had been Claire's idea. "You need to control the narrative," she told him at 2 a.m., still wearing her white dress, her makeup still flawless despite the evening's events. "By tomorrow afternoon, everyone will be talking about what happened. You need to give them the story you want them to tell." So here they were, Manhattan's elite gathered for Belgian waffles and damage control, discussing last night's successful gala as if nothing had happened. As if Daisy hadn't been escorted out of her own event. As if Matthew's pregnant wife wasn't currently alone in their guest house, refusing to answer his calls. "The auction exceeded projections by 30%, Claire announced to a cluster of admirers, her hand resting possessively on Matthew's arm. Matthew's leadership made all the difference. Matthew's leadership, not Daisy's months of planning, not her personal calls to donors, just Matthew's name, Matthew's influence, Matthew's success. Several guests nodded approvingly. Margaret Wells, who donated specifically for Daisy's literacy program, raised her glass. To Matthew, for his tireless commitment to the community. Matthew smiled reflexively, the expression feeling hollow even as he performed it. He'd barely slept. Kept seeing Daisy's face as she'd called his name across the ballroom. The way her voice had cracked. The hope in her eyes that he would... "Matthew?" Claire's voice pulled him back. "Patricia was just asking about the expansion plans." He forced himself to focus, to play the role, to pretend everything was fine. That's when the sound interrupted. It started low, a distant hum that made several guests pause mid-conversation. The kind of controlled, powerful sound that meant only one thing. A jet. Descending. "Are we expecting someone?" Patricia Morehouse asked, looking confused. "I thought this was a closed event." Matthew felt ice slide down his spine. "No, we're not expecting anyone." But the sound grew louder, closer, unmistakable. Claire's grip tightened on his arm. "Matthew, what is this?" He didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because he'd already realized who it had to be, and the realization was making his heart pound against his ribs. The Wallaces. Daisy's parents. Conversations died across the terrace as 60 guests turned toward the private runway at the edge of Matthew's property. A runway he'd installed for convenience, for impressing clients, for demonstrating the kind of wealth that commanded respect. The jet that appeared through the morning sky was modest by billionaire standards. No logo, no ostentatious design, just sleek, purposeful lines cutting through the air with absolute certainty. It touched down smoothly, professionally, its engines winding down to a controlled silence that somehow felt louder than the noise had been. No one on the terrace spoke. No one moved. They just watched as the door opened and stairs extended to the tarmac. Morris Wallace stepped out first. 72 years old, silver-haired, wearing a simple charcoal suit that probably cost less than most of the outfits on the terrace but fit him with the kind of dignity money couldn't purchase. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who'd never needed to prove anything to anyone. Then Velma Wallace appeared beside him. Elegant in a navy dress, her natural hair styled simply, her expression calm and unreadable. She took Morris's hand as they descended the stairs together. Not a power play. Just two people who'd been walking beside each other for 4 decades. They walked toward the terrace slowly. Not rushing, not performing, just present. The silence spread like a living thing. Claire's confidence flickered. Matthew watched it happen, saw her straighten her spine, lift her chin, prepare to assert dominance the way she always did. But something about Morris and Velma Wallace's approach made her hesitate. They carried authority the way gravity carries weight, invisible, undeniable, absolute. Matthew stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled. "Mr. and Mrs. Wallace, this is unexpected." Morris met his eyes with the kind of steady gaze that had probably faced down corporate boards and political powers without flinching. "So was watching our daughter be humiliated in front of 200 people who chose silence." The words landed like stones in still water. Ripples of discomfort spread across the terrace. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Claire began, her voice bright and dismissive. "There hasn't been," Velma interrupted quietly. The interruption was so calm, so absolute, that Claire simply stopped speaking mid-sentence. Velma's eyes swept across the assembled guests. These people who'd attended Daisy's gala, accepted her hospitality, benefited from her work, and then watched her be erased without a word of protest. "We've seen the footage," Velma continued, her voice carrying effortlessly across the silent terrace. "Multiple angles, very clear." Matthew's stomach dropped. Of course there was footage. Of course the staff had been watching. Of course someone had documented what happened. "Mrs. Wallace," he started, "I think we should discuss this privately." "Why?" Morris asked simply. "The humiliation was public. Why should the response be private?" Claire moved closer to Matthew, her body language protective or possessive. Matthew wasn't sure anymore which was which. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Claire demanded, her carefully constructed politeness finally cracking. "This is a private event. You weren't invited." Velma turned to her with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something far more devastating. Pity. "I'm the woman who taught my daughter to treat people gently," Velma said quietly, "even when they don't deserve it." Morris stepped forward slightly. "And I'm the man who taught her that kindness doesn't mean weakness." He looked directly at Matthew. "When she needed you, when your wife, carrying your child, was being publicly humiliated, where were you?" Matthew opened his mouth, closed it. He had no answer. Nothing that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. Cowardice disguised as discretion. 60 guests watched this unfold with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a perfectly controlled demolition. Claire attempted to regain control. "This is inappropriate. If you have concerns, we can arrange a meeting through proper channels." "We're not here for you," Velma said simply. That's when movement caught everyone's attention. Daisy appeared at the edge of the terrace, still wearing her emerald dress from last night, her hair pulled back, her face showing exhaustion, but also something else. Something new. Resolve. She walked toward her parents with measured steps. When she reached them, Velma opened her arms. Daisy stepped into her mother's embrace like coming home. Morris placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, his touch gentle but grounding. Then all 3 of them turned to face Matthew, Claire, and the assembled guests who'd chosen complicity over courage. Velma spoke into the loaded silence. "We'd like to have a conversation," she said calmly, "about what happened last night, about what's been happening for months, and about what happens next." It wasn't a request. It was a reckoning. The terrace had never been quieter. 60 guests held champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. Waiters stood motionless with trays balanced on their hands. Even the morning breeze seemed to pause, waiting for what came next. Velma Wallace didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Last night," she began, her tone conversational, almost gentle, "my daughter organized a charity gala that raised over $300,000 for literacy programs serving underserved communities. She did this while 7 months pregnant, while managing volunteers, while personally calling donors to thank them for their support." She paused, letting the information settle. "During that event, She was intercepted repeatedly by someone who questioned her presence, her credibility, and her right to be there. She was physically shoved. She was escorted out by security. And 200 people, many of you standing here right now, watched it happen. Margaret Wells looked down at her mimosa. Patricia Morehouse suddenly found her napkin fascinating. "We're not here to shame anyone," Velma continued. "We're here to ask a simple question. When did silence become acceptable?" Morris stepped forward, his eyes locked on Matthew. "You made vows to my daughter, to love her, to honor her, to stand beside her." His voice remained calm, but each word landed with weight. "Last night, when she needed you most, you chose discretion over devotion. You chose comfort over courage." Matthew's face had gone pale. "Mr. Wallace, I was trying to avoid making the situation worse." "By letting it happen?" Morris interrupted quietly. "By standing silent while another woman humiliated your pregnant wife in public?" "That's not what happened," Claire interjected sharply, stepping forward. "Daisy was emotional, unstable. I was trying to help her." "No." Velma's single word cut through Claire's explanation like a blade. "You don't get to speak to her anymore." The sentence hung in the air, not angry, not vengeful, just absolutely final. Claire's mouth opened, closed. For the first time since Daisy had known her, Claire looked uncertain. "You have spent months systematically undermining my daughter," Velma continued, her voice still controlled. "Intercepting her conversations, diminishing her work, positioning yourself as her replacement while she was carrying her husband's child. I am Matthew's colleague. You are the woman who pushed a pregnant woman at a charity event," Morris stated simply. "We have footage from 4 different angles. We have statements from 7 staff members who witnessed your behavior throughout the evening. We have documentation of your pattern of cruelty disguised as professionalism." Claire's confidence cracked visibly. She looked at Matthew for support. Matthew said nothing. Because what could he say? That he hadn't noticed? That he'd been too focused on business? That he'd prioritized his comfort over his wife's dignity for so long he'd stopped noticing when he did it? "Matthew," Morris said, his voice carrying the weight of profound disappointment, "you had a chance to be the man my daughter believed you were. You chose not to take it." Daisy had been standing silently between her parents, her hand resting on her belly where her daughter was kicking gentle reminders of presence. Now she stepped forward slightly. The crowd tensed, expecting anger, accusations, drama. Instead, Daisy's voice was quiet, steady, clear. "I spent months making excuses for you," she said, looking directly at Matthew. "Telling myself you were stressed, that you didn't notice. That you'd remember who we were if I just gave you time." Matthew's eyes were red-rimmed. "Daisy, You chose silence," she continued, not cutting him off with anger, but with simple truth. "When Claire questioned my place at our table, you said nothing. When she rewrote my event schedule, you said nothing. When she pushed me, you asked me not to make a scene." She took a breath, her hand pressing where the baby kicked. "I'm not making a scene, Matthew. I'm making a choice. The same choice you made last night when you decided I was the problem." Tears were streaming down Matthew's face now. "I love you. I was wrong. I was so wrong." "You were," Daisy agreed gently. "And I believe you believe that right now. But love isn't what you feel in crisis. It's what you do in ordinary moments. And in every ordinary moment for the past 6 months, you chose her comfort over my dignity." She turned to Claire, who looked smaller somehow, her white dress no longer a statement of power, but just expensive fabric. "I don't hate you," Daisy said, and meant it. "I pity you, because you built your entire identity on taking something from me, and you still don't understand that what matters about me was never something you could take." Claire opened her mouth, closed it. For once, she had no response. Velma placed her hand on Daisy's shoulder. "We should go." But before they turned away, Morris addressed the assembled guests one final time. "Some of you donated to my daughter's programs. Some of you volunteered beside her. Some of you claim to value the work she built." He paused. "Last night, when she needed that support to matter, you were silent. That's your choice to live with, not ours. He didn't wait for responses. None would have mattered. The three of them walked toward the jet together, Daisy between her parents, their hands linked, their steps measured and unhurried. Behind them, Matthew stood frozen, his carefully constructed brunch collapsing into uncomfortable silence. Claire tried to salvage something. "Well, that was certainly dramatic. Shall we continue?" But the guests were already setting down their glasses, making excuses, remembering urgent appointments. Because witnessing truth has a way of making complicity uncomfortable. And Velma Wallace had just reminded them all what they'd chosen to ignore. As Daisy reached the jet, she turned back one final time. Not to look at Matthew or Claire, but to look at the young server from last night, who stood at the edge of the terrace with tears streaming down her face. Daisy smiled at her. A real smile. Then she climbed the stairs and disappeared inside. The door closed. The engines started. And Daisy Weblock flew away from the life she'd tried to build, carried by the parents who'd taught her something essential. You don't need permission to leave a place where your dignity isn't honored. You just need to remember you were never meant to stay. The jet climbed through morning clouds, leaving Connecticut behind. Daisy sat between her parents in the quiet cabin, her hands still trembling slightly, her heart still processing what had just happened. She'd walked away. Actually walked away. "How do you feel?" Velma asked gently, her hand covering Daisy's. Daisy considered the question honestly. Sad, relieved, terrified. Free. She paused. All of them at once. "That sounds about right," Morris said from her other side. They didn't tell her she'd done the right thing, didn't offer platitudes about everything happening for a reason. They just sat with her in the complicated middle of grief and liberation, letting her feel both without rushing her toward resolution. "What happens now?" Daisy whispered. "Whatever you need to happen," Velma said simply. "You come home with us, you rest, you heal, and when you're ready, you decide what your life looks like next." For the first time in months, Daisy took a full breath. Matthew's apologies started within hours. Text messages first. "I'm so sorry. Please let me explain. I love you. I was wrong." Then emails, voicemails. Flowers delivered to her parents' home. Enormous arrangements that Daisy donated to the local hospital without reading the cards. "He wants to talk," Daisy told her mother 3 days later, staring at her phone where another message waited. "Do you want to talk to him?" Velma asked. Daisy thought about it, really thought about it. "I don't know what there is to say. He's sorry now, but he wasn't sorry when it mattered." "Then you have your answer." Eventually, Daisy did respond, a single message. "I need space. Please respect that." Matthew's messages continued for another week, then slowed, then stopped. Through mutual acquaintances, Daisy learned he'd moved out of the estate, that he'd put distance between himself and Claire, though whether from genuine remorse or damage control, Daisy couldn't say. She discovered she didn't particularly care which it was. Claire Ashford's social decline happened more quietly than her rise. No dramatic firing, no public scandal, just a gradual cooling of invitations, a subtle distance from people who'd once courted her favor. The footage from the gala had spread through private channels, not publicly, but among the circles that mattered. People remembered how she'd treated staff, how she'd undermined Daisy, how she'd pushed a pregnant woman and smiled while doing it. Money could buy a lot of things, but it couldn't purchase back a reputation built on cruelty. Within 2 months, Claire had accepted a position in London, far away from the consequences of her choices. Daisy felt neither satisfaction nor vindication when she heard. Just a quiet acknowledgement that some people exit your life the same way they entered it, loudly, dramatically, and ultimately alone. The grief came in waves, not for Matthew or not just for Matthew, for the marriage she'd believed in, for the future she'd imagined, for the man she'd thought he was versus the man he'd actually been. "I feel stupid," Daisy told her mother one evening, curled on the sofa with her hands on her belly. "How did I not see it sooner?" "Love makes us optimistic," Velma said gently. "That's not stupidity, that's hope. Hope that betrayed me. Hope that taught you something important." Velma sat beside her. "You learned the difference between kindness and self-abandonment, between grace and erasure. Those aren't small lessons, sweetheart. Daisy cried then, long, shuddering sobs that had been building for months. Her mother held her. Her father brought tea and blankets. The baby kicked protest against the sadness, as if reminding Daisy that new life was still coming, still demanding to be born into whatever came next. 6 weeks after leaving Connecticut, Daisy returned to her volunteer work. Not at the programs Matthew's foundation had supported. Those felt complicated, contaminated by association. Instead, she went back to the community center where she'd first started teaching literacy classes a decade ago. "Mrs. Weblock!" Mrs. Chen from the housing forums rushed to embrace her. "We heard what happened. Are you okay?" "I'm getting there," Daisy said honestly. "That woman who hurt you, she should be ashamed." "She probably isn't," Daisy said. "But that's her problem, not mine." She taught classes twice a week, helped with housing applications, sat with people who needed someone to listen without judgment. The work felt different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She was doing it for herself now, not to prove anything, not to earn love, just because it mattered. Her pregnancy progressed in warmth rather than isolation. Velma accompanied her to doctor's appointments, taking notes, asking questions, making Daisy laugh with stories about her own pregnancy decades ago. Morris converted his study into a temporary nursery, assembling furniture with the focused dedication of a man building something that would last. Friends from Daisy's volunteer programs threw her a baby shower, modest, heartfelt, filled with handmade gifts and genuine affection. No designer labels, no social competition, just people who'd shown up when it mattered. "This is what I needed," Daisy said, overwhelmed by their kindness. "This is what you always deserved," her friend Sarah corrected gently. At 36 weeks, Daisy received divorce papers. She signed them without hesitation, without bitterness. Matthew had agreed to generous terms: child support, trust funds, provisions for their daughter's future. Money was easy to give, her father had once said. Presence was what actually mattered. Matthew offered the money, but Morris and Velma offered presence, and Daisy finally understood which one her daughter would actually need. On a quiet Tuesday in March, Daisy sat in the nursery her father had built, folding tiny clothes and thinking about the woman she'd been 6 months ago. That woman had believed she needed to earn belonging, had thought kindness meant accepting whatever treatment came her way, had confused silence with peace. This woman, the one she was becoming, understood something different. Kindness without boundaries wasn't virtue, it was self-destruction. Grace without self-respect wasn't strength, it was surrender. And healing wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about refusing to let it define what came next. Her daughter kicked, strong, insistent, alive. "I know," Daisy whispered, her hand on her belly. "I feel you too, and I promise you something. You'll grow up knowing that love doesn't require you to disappear. That being kind doesn't mean being small. That you can be gentle and still take up space in the world." Outside, spring was breaking through winter's grip. Inside, Daisy Weblock was doing the same. And that, she was learning, was the loudest victory of all. Grace Eleanor Wallace was born on a Thursday in April, weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with her mother's eyes and her grandmother's determined chin. Daisy held her daughter for the first time in a hospital room filled with morning light, and everything else, the humiliation, the heartbreak, the months of grief, collapsed into a single perfect moment of clarity. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I'm your mama, and I have so much to tell you." Grace opened her eyes as if she'd been waiting to hear exactly that. Morris and Velma became the kind of grandparents who showed up not with extravagant gifts, but with presence. Morris walked the hospital corridors at 3 a.m., rocking Grace when Daisy needed sleep. Velma sat beside her daughter during feedings, offering water and encouragement and the kind of quiet companionship that felt like grace itself. "You're doing beautifully," Velma said one night, watching Daisy nurse her daughter with exhausted determination. "I don't feel beautiful. I feel terrified." "That means you're doing it right," Velma smiled. "Love is supposed to make you vulnerable. That's how you know it's real." Matthew sent flowers, a card, a request to meet his daughter. Daisy set boundaries, supervised visits, scheduled in advance, focused on grace rather than reconciliation. She wasn't punishing him. She was protecting herself. There was a difference, and she'd finally learned to recognize it. When Matthew held Grace for the first time, tears streaming down his face, Daisy felt something unexpected. Compassion. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe never. But recognition that he was human, flawed, capable of love even if he'd been incapable of showing it when it mattered most. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "She is," Daisy agreed. "And she deserves better than what we gave her." Matthew nodded, understanding the "we" meant something complicated. They'd both failed. Him through cruelty, her through endurance. Neither was the legacy they wanted their daughter to inherit. 3 months after Grace was born, Daisy returned to the community center where she'd taught her first literacy class a decade ago. This time, she brought her daughter in a carrier strapped to her chest. "Look who's here," Mrs. Chen exclaimed, rushing over to peer at the sleeping baby. "She's perfect." "She is," Daisy said, her hand protective on Grace's back. She taught classes with her daughter present, showing Grace from the beginning that service wasn't separate from life. It was woven through it. That helping people wasn't something you did when convenient. It was who you were when no one was applauding. Grace grew surrounded by people who understood that dignity wasn't conditional, who treated the homeless veteran and the corporate executive with identical respect, who measured worth in presence rather than possessions. On Grace's first birthday, Daisy stood in her parents' garden watching her daughter take wobbly steps between Morris and Velma, both of them beaming with grandparental pride. "She's fearless," Morris said, catching Grace as she stumbled. "She's her mother's daughter," Velma corrected. Daisy thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, standing in a ballroom, watching her husband choose silence while another woman raised her hand and threatened violence. How small she'd felt. How alone. She thought about the woman she was now, standing in sunlight, watching her daughter learn to walk, surrounded by people who'd taught her that strength didn't require domination, and kindness didn't require disappearance. That evening, as Daisy put Grace to bed, her daughter grabbed her finger with surprising strength. "You know what I'm going to teach you?" Daisy whispered. "I'm going to teach you to be kind, to see people clearly, to help without expecting anything in return." Grace yawned, her eyes already drifting closed. "But I'm also going to teach you something else, baby girl. Something I had to learn the hard way." Daisy's voice was soft but certain. "You never stay quiet when someone is being hurt. Not even when that someone is you, especially when that someone is you." Grace's fingers tightened around Daisy's, as if sealing a promise. "Kindness doesn't mean letting people erase you," Daisy continued. "It means knowing your worth clearly enough that you can love others without losing yourself." She kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the smell of baby shampoo and new beginnings. Outside, spring had fully arrived. Flowers blooming despite winter's attempts to suppress them. Life insisting on itself with quiet, relentless power. Years later, when people asked Daisy about the gala, about the humiliation, about the marriage that ended, she would tell them this. "I learned that silence isn't neutrality, that kindness without boundaries is self-destruction. That grace means honoring yourself as much as others." And when they asked if she regretted any of it, she would look at her daughter, bright, compassionate, fierce in her gentleness, and smile. "I regret the pain, but I don't regret what it taught me or who it revealed." The final image wasn't a raised hand threatening violence. It was hands joined in protection. Daisy's holding Grace's, teaching her daughter to walk through a world that would sometimes be cruel, sometimes be kind, but would always require her to know the difference. And in that difference lived everything that mattered. Kindness didn't make her weak. It revealed who never was,